French are known for their strong opinions and appreciation for intellectualism. They are often well versed in philosophy, the arts, music, and aesthetics, or the beauty of all things. Critical thinking is an important part of their schooling. The French language is known for its preciseness, logic, and its natural proclivity, or path to poetry. This is valued by the French in their language. They enjoy order and structure in society, but have a suspicious outlook of authority. They quickly question, have contrary opinions, or even rebel against the status quo. This mindset has led to many cultural movements throughout history. This is a two-part episode on the story of their language. Before Roman general Julius Caesar invaded France, 58 to 51 BCE, the Celtic language Gaul was the language of the French. Latin became the main language spoken during the 5 centuries of Roman occupation. French would develop out of Latin, but also had a fair influence from Gaul. The Franks, a German people, would invade France in 486 CE and rule it until 843. Charlemagne, as one of the most powerful rulers in European history, was part of this ruling from 768 to 1814. There was a mini Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries under Charlemagne in France. The pursuit of knowledge, aside from this effort, was completely absent during the Middle Ages. The Normans arrived in what is now known as Normandy, in northwest France in the 9th and 10th centuries. These were Vikings, mostly from Denmark, but also Norway and Sweden. They would eventually adopt the French language and culture. Throughout the Middle Ages, French had noticeable influences from Germanic, including the Scandinavian languages. This came mostly from Charlemagne and the Normans or Vikings. Old French would emerge from this and exist in the 8th through 14th century. Compared to modern French, Old French had different pronunciations, lacked silent sounds, had more complicated grammar, and the meaning of many words was slightly and sometimes completely different. The early architectural style of medieval Europe, or the Dark Ages, was Romanesque. This depended on thick concrete walls, was very bulky, and didn't have much flexibility. Gothic architecture was first developed in France during the 11th century. It allowed for much larger structures, more glass to let light in, and numerous other feature advancements. The most famous example of Gothic architecture is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which began construction in 1163, but there are also numerous other well-known examples. Gothic architecture dominated in European churches, especially cathedrals, for several hundred years, but was also used in castles, universities, palaces, town halls, and other buildings. The French language is one of the cradles of the world's literary history. Medieval French literature is classified as being from the 11th to the 15th century. From this came the Song of Roland in the 11th century, an epic poem placed in the time of Charlemagne. This was the period of the fabled stories of Camelot, King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and the quest for the Holy Grail, which many took to mean the search for one's purpose in life. Much of this was written by Chrétien de Troyes in the 12th century. France was an early adopter of humanism, and the Renaissance after this was developed in Italy. The Renaissance brought about perspective that created an accurate 3D perspective on a 2D canvas. One of the ways a painter was taught to do this was to take an empty painting frame and place it on an easel. The painter then would stand back a short distance and paint what they could see inside the painting frame, which was whatever was in back of the frame. For example, the artist might be able to see real mountains, or perhaps the sea through the frame. The artist would then paint the mountains or sea just as they saw them through the frame. Renaissance literature of the 16th century saw humanists such as Francois Rabelais emerge. Rabelais wrote about the absurdity of institutions and society and limiting the potential of individuals. He encourages individuals to think for themselves and to question norms. I am surprised he was able to get away with this. Certainly through a good part of history, this would have gotten him burned at the stake for questioning authority. Frenchman René Descartes, one of the greatest intellectuals of world history, made substantial contributions in the 17th century to mathematics, philosophy, and science. He did much of his work in the Netherlands as he left France for fear of prosecution from the Inquisition. I did a previous video on him and linked it below. The 18th century Age of Enlightenment would occur after a long continuance of religious wars. Political philosophers would build on the idea of humanism and the Renaissance, calling into question religious authority along with a demand for religious tolerance. For nearly 350 years, coffee shops and cafes in Paris have been gathering spots for philosophers, poets, writers, and other intellectuals who would gather for discussion, debate, and the sharing of new ideas. Coffee shops were known as penny universities, as anyone could go there and discuss the various intellectual topics. The beatniks of the 1940s to 70s in the U.S. would also borrow this idea. They would typically get together to discuss literature, philosophy, and ideologies influenced by the lost generation of Americans who had picked this up in Paris in the early 1920s. The concept of salons evolved from this cafe idea. This became a French phenomenon as gathering spots for the wealthy and intellectuals to debate and dictate policy. Salons were organized with agendas, and only the invited could attend. Often wealthy socialite women organized these salons at their houses. Most of the greatest French minds of this era would attend salons. They were often held weekly, and many French philosophical and artistic movements began at these salons. Thomas Jefferson attended many salons in his 5-year stay in France before becoming President of the United States. The salons reached their peak during the Age of Enlightenment and Reason before the French Revolution in 1789, but would continue well into the 20th century. The ideas of the 18th century French and English Enlightenment were some of the most progressive political theories ever created. These had a profound effect on the American Constitution, the American Revolution in 1776, and the French Revolution 13 years later. I have another video on this that is also listed below. Montesquieu wrote Persian Letters in 1721, a fictional work about the observations of French society by 2 Persian noblemen who journeyed from Iran and lived in Paris for 10 years. The themes it touched upon most heavily were inequality within France and Europe, religious intolerance, the potential for personal freedom, and various social structures and cultural shock. These observations were placed in letters and sent back home by the visitors. Voltaire's Candide is from 1759. The novel follows the misadventures of Candide as he stumbles through life. It was a harsh criticism of German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz's point that life is perfect because God created it that way. Denis Diderot's Jacques the Fatalist and his Master from 1785 explores character discussions on life, fate, and free will versus determinism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote Emily, or On Education, in 1763. This is on the nature of education and the nature of man. He felt a significant part of education should instead also teach an individual to be moral and to have civic responsibility. that education should be dictated by natural curiosity and experience. French has had a large influence on the development of the English language. England had French rulers for 419 years. This began in 1066 when William the Conqueror invaded England from Normandy into northwest France in that year. This was mostly under two ruling dynasties, the House of Normandy, 1066 to 1135, and the House of Plantagenet, 1154 to 1485. The Plantagenet rulers came from Anjou, slightly to the east of Normandy in France. From 1066 to 1413, the first language of these rulers of England was French, and from 1413 to at least 1485, the rulers were fluent in it. Nearly all of these kings took French wives. Many French words were then brought into English. It is estimated more than 30% of the English language words have their origin in French. The French colonial empire from the 16th century to 1814 colonized nearly all of eastern Canada, most of the U.S. east of the Rocky Mountains, excluding the 13 colonies, in Florida. A series of wars with Great Britain throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century had France losing the majority of this and retaining just several islands and French Guiana in South America. Of the lost colonized areas, only the U.S. state of Louisiana and the Canadian province of Quebec would maintain a strong French identity and language. The Second French Colonial Empire was the sixth largest empire ever. It was about 3.5 times larger than the First French Colonial Empire. The Second Colonial Empire began in 1830 with France invading Algiers in present-day Algeria. The French would acquire virtually all of the northwestern quarter of Africa except for Nigeria and some much smaller areas. They would also retain Madagascar, Syria, Lebanon, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Tahiti, and other areas. When I traveled through the various areas of the Sahara, little children, knowing I was passing through, would run out of their houses, quickly yell, "Ça va, ça va," or "How are you? How are you?" always followed by giggles and running back into their houses as if they were getting away with something. I would yell back, "Ça va très bien," or "It's going well." I would be sure to say it out loud enough that they heard it in their houses. I realized their enthusiasm and giggles were both from a brief moment of courage and pride in knowing how to greet a white person, followed by shyness. I always found it endearing, and to this day, it brings a smile to my face. Virtually all these areas now have their independence, with only Tahiti, some Caribbean islands, and other places small in size or population being French territories. The southern part of Belgium speaks mostly French. This extends back to the time of the Gauls, when their homeland was France and this area in Belgium. They, like France, switched to Latin when Rome took over the land of the Gauls. Western Switzerland and virtually all the people of Luxembourg speak French, as does Zeeland, the southernmost territory in the Netherlands. Something like 9% of Germans speak French, and areas like Saarland along the border of France hold strongly onto French culture. Thank you so much for watching. The next video will be a continuation of the French language, mostly covering the impact that the French language and culture have had on modern times. Have a great day, and I hope to see you back when this is launched.